Welcome to Driving Alpha, where we feature our friends, the outperforming investors who demonstrate their path to driving alpha or outsized investment returns. We're Alpha Partners, where we partner with 1,000 early-stage venture firms as their opportunity capital to invest in their best companies.
Hi, I'm Steve Brotman. I'm your host of Driving Alpha, where together we engage in conversations with allocators of capital and entrepreneurs in the venture capital and tech realm. The inspiration for this podcast came from a supercar event I hosted with my firm about 10 years ago with my favorite VC and investor friends, as well as entrepreneurs. And every year, what I would do is I'd rent 6 exotic supercars, Lamborghinis and Ferraris and McLarens, just for the day, and invite 11 other investors and VCs and entrepreneurs to spend the day together. So each car would hold 2 people, a driver, passenger, and we'd swap cars and driver positions every half hour. And it turns out that the cars were fun, but it was really the people and the interactions between those people for 30 to 60 minutes at a time that was really just the best part of the day for everyone. And the food was great and the drinks were great afterwards and the dinner. But what this podcast was really inspired by is an attempt to recreate that type of conversation. And I thought about who our first call should be with. And starting with, I thought it would be awesome to start with someone who knows a thing or two about broadcast media, but more importantly, about interviewing well, particularly with well-regarded alpha creators and investors. I've known Ron Insana for over 20 years now. We were co-investor in an ill-fated startup. I think we got our money back, but
well, you did. I was on the board. I just didn't make anything.
Yeah. So that was the only hang up there is that we didn't do very well. We didn't, it wasn't a home run, but it was actually a predecessor to YouTube.
Yeah.
The company was before YouTube, and they were the first company to install servers, right?
Yep.
In every broadcast media market. And they made that searchable before YouTube, right?
Yeah. And in fact, not only that, you could pull clips from it on a fair use basis, if I recall correctly, and utilize those in any fashion that you desired, as long as you didn't violate IP rules.
So Ron was obviously a great board member to have. And we actually came up, I mean, not to go down this rat hole, but, we just thought if we released this to the world and made the world of broadcast media searchable today to anyone, all consumers, this is before YouTube, we just would have been sued out of existence. And we couldn't figure out how to get around that. And YouTube figured that out, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we were dealing with fair use, right? I mean, if you I can't remember exactly how long the duration of the clip was that you were allowed to use without getting sued or without having to compensate the creator. It was relatively short.
And it was also on a B2B basis. So like if you sold a clip for business purposes versus consumer use, the company ended up being a B2B play versus a B2C play, which is a much smaller market. But it's really, astonishing that we were right there. And if we had taken a left instead of a right, we both would be probably doing something very different than recording this podcast today.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. So I was, we have these CFO councils at CNBC, and I can't necessarily disclose who we talked to, but I was talking to somebody today who's in a business very similarly that in the internet days, everyone thought was going to explode and then disappeared. And this company has come along now and made a roaring success in the exact same category. And it's amazing that if you miss by that much when you're coming up, it's the difference between being a bust and being a rousing success. And some of it's timing, some of it's being too early. In the internet days, there were a lot of companies that were just simply too early, and the mechanisms for success weren't necessarily there. Great idea, wrong time. Yeah, I mean, you can go all the way back to Compact Computer or even John Scully with the personal digital assistant, which is now an iPhone effectively. And, and Compaq had one and everybody had one and BlackBerry had one. Then Apple comes out with the iPhone and blows everybody out of the water. So the margin for error is always kind of slim, you know.
So talking about that, getting back to your career, I mean, how did you how did you wake
Talk
up
about margin for error.
yeah, talk about CNBC was a huge startup success. Cable
Well, yeah,
success
except it wasn't
back in
really.
the
I
day.
mean, the funny thing about it was Financial News Network, where I worked originally, was the predecessor
Right.
network. And so that launched in November of 1981. And if you remember Bill Griffith and Sue Herrera, they were the two of the anchors in November of 1981. They were actually there before FNN went on the air. They were practicing in the parking lot to do live business television somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 or so hours a day. A friend of mine from high school got me a job at FNN when I got out of college. I was a film major, actually, and I couldn't find any work on the entertainment side. So I was just desperate to get a gig in media of some sort. And he got me an entry-level position at Financial News Network as a production assistant, which was ripping wires, tearing scripts, getting coffee, doing all that kind of stuff. Got fired 4 months later, actually, because they went through about to go through a massive cutback. I was the last one hired, so I was the first one let go. And a week, 3 days after I got let go, our assignment editor called me up and said, "Hey, looks like we're going out of business. Come on down for a party." They weren't really going out of business. They were going to break even overnight. So they fired 95% of the editorial staff, kept my friend in the position of producer, my friend Casey Wyan, who went on to not just FNN and CNBC, but also CNN. And then he stayed for 4 months, called me up after they were down to a skeleton staff. Bill Griffith and Sue Herrera were the only two anchors on the air. And he called me up in February of 85. So I was released in October of 84, 4 months after I started my job. And he asked me if I wanted his job as a producer. Now, in the intervening months, Bill and Sue were ad-libbing 8 hours of live business television between them every day. And so when I came back 3 months after that, they both called in sick on the same day. I put myself on the air for 2 updates because there was no one else in the room. And we had to bring back people who had been fired just to clear the day. And 3 months after that, I got a full-time gig.
Hey, so you were like an intern.
I went from production assistant to producer to anchor in the space of 1 year and 4 months. So no experience with the content because I was a film major, never took an economics class in my life. Mark had no idea what was going on in financial markets. And I ended up at Anchor by the time I was 24. And it was a learn as you go. Happily, I had some people around me, Bill and Sue included. Michael Crichton's younger brother, Doug, who ultimately became my best friend and sadly about 10 years ago passed away, was an early mentor of mine. And he would tell me what to go read. And, I would go to my college library in Southern California and I'd read Wall Street journals from the 1920s because the 80s were starting to feel a little bit like the 20s at that time. He gave me books to read. We would call people back then who literally folks like Henry Kaufman, really big names on Wall Street, would take our phone calls and give us explanations as to why what was happening, even though they didn't know us personally and they barely had ever heard of FNN. And so that process went on for 7 years. We ended up going bankrupt. We were acquired by CNBC, came out to New Jersey from Los Angeles, where FNN was originally based, in 1991. And then by 1997, it actually really took off. That's when things really, really, really got hot. That's when I was doing crossover stuff at MSNBC, NBC Network, the Today Show, Nightly News, Dateline, all that kind of stuff. Imus in the morning radio. And then, by the time 2006 or so rolled around, I'd done pretty much everything I could do in my space. And so I started to venture out to do some other things like a fund of hedge funds, which you're familiar with my experience there, which was 2006 to 2008. And that was its own unique and less than enjoyable experience in my career, but great learning experience, having said that.
Talk about getting to meet people who created Alpha.
Yeah, everybody.
Of hedge fund managers
Yep.
took your call.
Yeah.
And it was just bad timing, of course.
Oh, yeah. Listen, when I was leaving, and so I called upon guys who were sources of mine and who I knew, or either knew of me and I knew of them, guys like Art Sandberg. I mean, Steve Cohen was the first person to say, "I'll give you $100 million of capacity in one of my funds." And right after that, 34 other people fell in line. So it was Art Sandberg, it was Lee Cooperman, it was D.E. Shaw. I called David Shaw directly, actually, and asked him, Renaissance, the guys at Fortress, everybody said yes. Dan Benton, a whole host of individuals were perfectly fine giving me capacity. So when we launched the fund on Deutsche Bank's platform in 2007, I had $100 million of capacity with 35 different managers. We launched with 15 and added 5 more. We were down 23% in 2008, but the gentleman who had put in the operating capital for my business, I'll leave his name out of it, declined to put the third year in. So in 2008, we were doing revenues of 900,000 net, a burn of 2 million, had to sell the fund. And once it was sold, it did great in 2009. So
Yeah.
as they say, stuff happens, you know.
And probably just any other year, you would have been just
any other
fine.
year. Yeah.
Another year.
1 year earlier, we would have had $1 billion.
So tell me, like, who was I mean, I guess you can't, I guess of all those folks that you just mentioned, or even folks that you've interviewed, who was the person that was the most impressive, the most striking, like most memorable to, at least to you, just was like, whoa.
Yeah, there were a couple actually. I mean, certainly Bill Clinton, and he was my first presidential interview.
Okay.
Towards the end of '99, he was on this anti-poverty swing that I traveled with him through Appalachia, and we did an interview on a furniture factory floor in an enterprise zone in Clarksdale, Mississippi. So those are always a little different, in a certain sense, because they have a different protocol than most other interviews. But he was fascinating. I ended up interviewing him 3 times in 7 months, and each one got better. Interviewed Bush, interviewed Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Steve Jobs. Really, a whole host of individuals. Well, Warren and I had an interesting relationship. I didn't know him ever. When I was on the air one morning, early 1990s, and Joe Kernan used to do a segment called Stocks to Watch, and so Berkshire Hathaway earnings were out, and so we were kind of going over Berkshire's component companies, and having come from California to New Jersey at that time, See's Candy, which Warren owned inside Berkshire Hathaway, the candy was not available in New Jersey. And so we were talking about our favorite companies inside Berkshire Hathaway, and I said mine was See's, and Joe said his was NetJets. So less than 24 hours later, I get to my desk. There are these 2 huge boxes sitting on my desk, and I open them up. It's 10 pounds of See's Candy. I open the note, and it says, "Thanks for the mention, Warren." Now, I didn't know him, didn't know that he watched CNBC or had somebody who watched it for him. So I called him up. He took the call, and he said, I said, "Thank you very much. It's really nice of you." He said, "You're going to share that with the office, right?" And I said, "Absolutely not." I said, "I'll leave 1 pound here." I said, "I can't get it here." I said, "I'm taking 9 pounds home." And he said, "Tell Kernan he's not getting the jet." And, that was my introduction to Warren Buffett. So we ended up doing a couple other things together over time. And, he was always nice enough to take the call, always nice enough to talk. And that was the same with a lot of these individuals. Bob Rubin, I thought, was always fascinating. Had a lot of off the record time with Alan Greenspan during his time at the Fed, and and then Hillary Clinton or Ann Mulcahy or Queen Rania of Jordan, Mikhail Gorbachev after he was Soviet premier. What I found really fascinating about all these different people, and it was true, Stan Druckenmiller, George Soros, Julian Roberts, and all those guys as well. They all had an insatiable curiosity, and they would quiz me as much as, after we were done, as much as I quizzed them during an interview. It was always a two-way street. They were always looking for more information, or always looking for another nugget. And that's what I really found fascinating about the people that I liked talking to the most, was not necessarily that it was a kind of a sign of respect, but it was also just the intellectual curiosity that as my late friend Doug used to say, having rats in your belly. The fact that you couldn't rest until you knew the answer was something that was really common among all these folks. Jack Welch included, my own boss, for many years. Jack would call up and just ask questions about stuff going on, and Bob Wright would do the same. If they had, if they saw something or they thought you saw something, they'd be like, what was it? Fill me in. And that was always pretty cool. That was a very cool part of the gig,
Wow. Well, that's right. That's just sort of, that's like what I would call psychic ward. It's funny, it just occurred to me, we've formed a relationship over 20 years plus, and I'd be asking you questions about different things. But
Same.
inevitably, you'd ask me as many questions as I asked you back. And that's sort of that's what was remarkable about our relation. I always thought, I was like, why does this guy even care about what I do? And what do I think about this?
Well,
And
you just never know what you're missing, right? I mean, and so, having been a practiced questioner, right, which was my job for all intents and purposes, right? You're in a
right.
certain sense, you're a glorified teacher when you're on the air, and then in the other sense, you're a glorified researcher when you're off. And so you get paid to ask questions, both on air and off air, and then in the old days anyway, it was tell me what you know, not what you think. Now it's tell me what you think, not what you know. But we actually went out and tried to beat the bushes for real information. So talking to you or some of your counterparts, going to Alan Patrickoff or other folks in the VC space, the private equity space, or any one of these other areas where you guys all had your fingers on the pulse. The hedge fund world, everybody had, and everybody understood the fact that they needed an edge. So you went to talk to the people who required an edge, because if you're talking to anybody else, you're behind the curve, right? So you wanted to talk to people who were at the forefront of something, which included VCs like yourself. You guys were seeing things that other people didn't see. So that's kind of the difference maker in what we did, right? Which was, if you dug up one of those nuggets, that's a differentiator for you or me in my case, because
That's your currency. That's your currency.
Oh, entirely. Yeah.
Your edge, if you will. And that's why people tuned in, because they just needed to, get that edge. And that was your job. So what, changing direction a little bit, and this is sort of more, there's a lot of changing happening in financial media. You touched on it, sort of tell me what you think versus what you know. What's the future of financial media? Like, if there might not be a good answer, but like the whole TikTok mess, and I mean, it's just, with Twitter and just all sorts of craziness going on. Do you think that fragmentation is going to continue?
Yeah.
Is there going to be some centralization? There's sort of fragmentation, then centralization type of thing.
Well, typically that's what happens in any business, right? I mean, but the question is, like, will CNBC, which has for quite a long time now been the centrifugal force in the business, do they suddenly become an acquirer of other assets that broaden our reach? And I don't know the answer to that, because those are conversations I'm not privy to. But if I were in that chair, certainly I'd be looking to acquire digital assets that extend our reach. Obviously, they've done a lot, quite frankly, with CNBC.com, CNBC Pro, which is a subscription service that I'm not supposed to reveal the number of subscribers, but it's a substantial number. Then Jim has his investment club. That too is a way to monetize some of what we do. We've gone from being in 110 million homes, and it's no secret about cord cutting. I think we're down to 65 or 70 million. So that has an impact on subscription fees and audience size, and to a certain extent, advertising rates as well. Not rates, but the advertising, the gross dollars. So yeah, I think, the fragmentation is going to continue for a while. And look, I'm getting involved in an AI-based fintech that has some interesting properties to it, where we can provide forecasted returns on individual stocks or ETFs, and additional information beyond that, asset allocation modeling, portfolio construction tools. And to a certain extent now, you continue to disaggregate the business, right? Where if you're in a sleeve that can provide a service for individuals, self-directed traders, investment advisors, you're suddenly taking up some of the space that places like CNBC used to occupy, by bringing on guests with that expertise. So to the extent that AI is going to affect that, I think that's something we need to be cognizant of at CNBC and learn to use and adopt those tools to add value to the people who are watching. And then we reach them again digitally through CNBC.com and these other various services that we have. And we're also, branching further out into events. And, what everybody's found is events are really powerful and popular, as you suggested, with Driving Alpha. When you start putting people together, that has its own magic as well.
You mentioned this AI fintech. Are you at liberty to talk about that anymore? Or?
Almost.
Okay.
Give me, what is it, the 15th? 12 days.
might get some calls then from some of my friends. Of course, that's
I think we're doing a Series A pretty soon. So
all right.
yeah,
Well, certainly that's a great timing then.
yeah.
So to shift gears, I mean, you talk to some of these world leaders, um, not to get political,
Mhm.
but you
Yeah, I
know,
cover Trump too.
are
So
you a sort of an optimist or pessimist about America? Like, what do you
I
think?
think at the
Best days
moment,
ahead or behind?
I mean, generally, I'm an optimist. I am concerned about the period in which we find ourselves right now. And the jury's out as to which way it's going to go. I mean, and listen, I look at the polls, I look at, what people are saying about the upcoming elections in November. I tend to believe that it is actually a decision that's going to determine whether we stick with democracy or veer towards autocracy. Whether or not an autocrat can be successful in the United States, I think in the longer run is an open question. And there's still checks and balances that exist.
Hmm.
When you read, some of the excerpts of Project 2025, which the Heritage Foundation put out, suggesting that President Trump would gut the civil service and put in 54,000 loyalists, or do things that would circumvent, other controls that are typically used on the executive branch, and then use the Department of Justice, in a weaponized fashion. Those things do worry me. And we'll see, and we'll find out. Sometimes you get the government you deserve if that's really what people want. And then we'll see how it plays out after that. I'm not, I don't effectively or officially play for either team. I voted both ways in a wide variety of elections. And I think, you take the good ideas where they come from, irrespective of party. I do think this is a different environment. I don't think the party of Trump is the Republican Party that I grew up with. And so it's a little unnerving, having covered him as well, and having, kind of seen him in a different light than most people get to see him. He worries me, even from a human perspective, not just a political one. Um,
Yeah.
and
Whether
look, having said that, I would prefer, as much as I have a certain fondness for Joe Biden, because I've known him on and off for a long time since he was a senator. And he was always kind of a square shooter with, if we encountered him in those days, and so on and so forth. So, and I also happen to think some of his policies of late were fairly, wise. The Chips and Science Act, the poorly named Inflation Reduction Act, which was really infrastructure and energy transition. Those things seem to have, borne some fruit, at least so far. So I think he's done a good job with it, and he's dealt a horrible hand. So in that respect, my personal preference is that things continue on as they are, because I'd prefer we not experiment with another system.
Mhm.
This one's working pretty well for a while. It's got its good points and its bad points, but net, the U.S. is still a pretty good place to hang your hat, and I hope that is something that I can say again, several months from now.
Yeah, I'm yeah, I think I sit similarly. I have more confidence in our system, but to your point, the executive power point, something I hadn't really thought too much about. I think that the judiciary and the legislative branches are going to hold. But it's going to be it'll be interesting to see if that happens. You know what eventuality you see what's happening in Argentina, where they keep
Yeah.
what, six branches of government or six bureaucracies, and I'm sort of cheering from here, but at the same time, like if that happened in the U.S., it'd be remarkable for one. It sounds like I think there's a lot of dig in there, so it'll be we'll see what happens.
I mean, to answer your question, certainly about the economy and the markets for the remainder of this year,
Yeah.
I'm pretty optimistic. It seems like it's an okay environment. It's probably a 2% growth year. It's probably a decent mid, mid single digits, which we're already at, the high single digits, equity return year. My guess is the Fed cuts rates a couple of times, which will soften, any slowdown that might be ahead of us. So in that regard, I've been talking about having an abnormally normal year as far as the economy and markets are concerned, but having a wild year, both politically and geopolitically, that might be, unsettling to not only people who watch this professionally, but to really anybody who's paying attention.
Well, before I allow you to turn the tables here, we're making this new podcast. Do you have any advice or key things we should focus on? I think the first thing that you said to me when we were talked a few weeks back was you're like, get a good booker, meaning get good people on.
Yeah.
That was like the number one thing you said. I was like, booker, what's a booker?
It's a little industry jargon. An associate
Right.
producer who has a great Rolodex and finds you fantastic guests. So yeah, that's what we generally call associate producers, of which my wife was one when I was an anchor. So and it's funny. The funny thing was most of the young people who had that job hated it, because they felt it was a fairly menial job where you just make phone calls, ask people to come on the air, and you do a pre-interview. And I'm like, look, this is your education, right? This is how you learn. You're talking to people that you would never otherwise speak to. Ask them questions, write down the answers, and go to school, and use it as an opportunity. And by the way, tuck away their numbers in your personal Rolodex just in case.
You will never, right. They might even call you back.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I used to book a lot of my own guests in the early days of my career when I was an anchor, which, just for lack of resources, we all did that ourselves. And it proved to be in my life a phenomenally valuable experience. The fact that you learn how to pick up the phone, after Alan Greenspan had his irrational exuberance comment in early December of 1996, we'd never been in the Fed before at CNBC. So I called up his top PR person and I said, listen, we've been locked out forever. You guys talk to everybody else. What are the chances I can come down and have an off the record with him? Because we really don't know. And we're having an internal argument at CNBC about what he meant with respect to that irrational exuberance question. Was it a throwaway line, or did they really mean to have an impact on the markets? Which, if you recall, I think the market fell like 2% the next day, maybe a little more than that, because everybody thought he was trying to burst the internet bubble that was just forming at the time. And so they let me come down, and that started a process of, like 3 times a year going to the Fed and chatting with Alan Greenspan. So, when someone else, when a younger person gets that opportunity to call folks, I think it's a great opportunity for them. And 2, it's a great benefit to you, because you just tell them to reach for the stars. Most of those people will take the call. It's pretty shocking. I mean, I'll tell you, when I was at FNN, really young, I remember I was lining up regular guests when I first got on the air. I called Elaine Garzarelli, who at the time was one of the hottest analysts on Wall Street. I called Larry Wachtel, who was a famous Wall Street personage back in the 80s, and Art Cashin, who was on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, and 2 or 3 other people to make them regular guests on the show. And they all said yes. And they were doing phoners every morning at 10 Eastern or somewhere around that time. And it's amazing how much people want to interact and want to do things like this. And they enjoy the conversation. They enjoy the experience. I think that's first and foremost. And then going into areas that no one else is touching, I think makes a big difference. There's, 1,000 political, podcasts right now. They're market podcasts, ad nauseum. I think in the space where you operate, if you start talking about cutting edge technologies and what you see coming down the pipe that nobody else happens to see, that's going to be something that people are going to want to know.
Cool. Well, thanks, Ron. This is excellent. Excellent start to our podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Driving Alpha podcast, where we host top investors to demonstrate how they outperform the market. Click subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.